I think the backstory for Quavos really starts when I was in sixth grade and I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Before synthetic insulin, if you were diabetic, you'd just be dead within a month. And I realized that those like crispy pieces of crunch, like a chip, but they were totally carbless. She tasted it. She said, "This is perfect. It crunches like a chip. Go to market with this product immediately."
So Zach, so we're talking about your company and kind of how you started. Can you just give us a high level overview of kind of Quavos and kind of the idea and kind of the thoughts behind it? How did you get it started?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and thanks for having me, Colby. Really excited to do this with you. I think the backstory for Quavos really starts when I was in sixth grade and I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And, for those of the audience that aren't familiar with type 1 or don't know somebody with type 1, basically what happens is that your body attacks your pancreas. And so you end up not being able to produce insulin. And insulin is necessary for using the sugars, the carbs that you consume, shuttling those carbs to the cells and into the cells, they can be used as energy. Basically, before synthetic insulin, before the production of insulin, which started in 1921, if you were diabetic, you'd just be dead within a month. There was no other, way for your body to survive other than to have insulin present. And so, with the evident modern medicine and the production of insulin, the type 1 is tasked with effectively managing their blood sugars using insulin, which is kind of like a full-time job. Like you have to know hour of the day that goes by where you don't have to be concerned with where your sugar's at and how much insulin you have kind of circulating in your bloodstream and all that. That kind of created a need for me, kind of created some insight. And I think type 1s are really intimately familiar with the kind of need for the body to be in homeostasis. Like you really do see this kind of feedback loop and you see what happens when the feedback loop breaks down. And so I think, it both created a problem I needed to solve, some insight that I've taken with me to other areas of life. But fast forward about 5-10 years, something in that range. And I've been making lots of eggs because they're basically low carb and highly nutritious. And the beauty of a low carb stack for a diabetic is they don't have to think about it. I realized that those like crispy pieces of egg white or egg that would coat the pan after I made an omelet crunched like a chip, but they were totally carbless. I thought, if I can make chips out of this, that would be a huge boon for me and other type 1 diabetics. And I didn't really think I was going to make a business out of it. I just played around in the kitchen and, made some snacks I liked. But my best friend and I from growing up got together and kind of decided that we could actually do something with it. And so he took the idea actually with my permission to the incubator at Chicago where he went to undergrad, and people loved the idea. This is kind of 2018, so right during the keto wave, or like when the keto is kind of at its highest point. And so there was just obvious demand and, real market fit that we could tap into. And, we had a cool idea on our hands. So pursued it and kind of the rest is history.
Right. So it's interesting too. I know a lot of people start a business. One of the things that comes up, and I know I've dealt with this myself too, is a name. You can agonize over a name. So walk me through that process, Quavos. I know Quavo the rapper, but how did you come up with Quavos? Walk us through your naming process.
Actually, in the naming process, it's usually better to start with the idea that you want to convey rather than the particular word that you choose. So anytime I do branding work for anything from now, I start with the meaning. I start with the kind of the purpose, and then I move to the more specific way of communicating that purpose. I think that's broadly useful. Actually, one of these books on my shelf here, Get to Aha, is like really good at describing that kind of process of really starting with the ideas first and then moving to the more specific kind of like way in which you dress up those ideas. For Quavos, that wasn't our process. It was more just we were sitting around the table, just shooting ideas around, basically brainstorming. And, we were familiar with the word huevos, which is eggs in Spanish. And then it was kind of like dressing it up, anglicizing it a little bit. And the Q, I think, basically stood for quick, on the go or convenient. And so we went with it. And, but yeah, not too rigorous a process. Going forward, I've definitely, had more rigor as I've been thinking about branding concepts and whatnot.
Yeah, I've actually one time hired a naming consultant. This is before ChatGPT, where you can type in and start, figuring out a lot of different things. So you said 2000, what year you started with your 2011?
Yeah, I was diagnosed in 2011, and then I was I've got some pictures dating back to around then where I was like making these little strips of cooked egg white. I was frying it or microwaving it or baking it or whatever. But it actually wasn't until the summer after my senior year of high school that I had some free time. I was doing a little running coaching, but I had a good amount of time during the day free. And so I just, kind of returned to it and started iterating that idea. And that's when I had the idea to turn it into a business. And then about a year later, during our sophomore year of college is when it kind of really bloomed.
Okay. How'd you get your first customer?
Oh, that's a good question. So I wasn't there for this part of the process because this was at his undergrad incubator, but I remember there was, and he related to me, that there was a woman who was doing a keto diet, and we had our very basic prototype that was like very gritty, very dry, not very good, but she tasted it. She said, "This is perfect. It crunches like a chip. Go to market with this product immediately." And so she bought some off us, but I'm glad that we didn't go to market with that product. It became a lot better over time.
And that brings up a question: MVP, minimum viable product. So you didn't go to market. When someone say you should go to market, I guess, how did you know when you was ready? Because you could iterate forever and ever and get in your head. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs do that. When did you know it was the right time to go to market?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a general framework that you could create that kind of describes the trade-offs. But as you sort of alluded to just then, there's pros and cons to going to market with any given product. The more work you do in-house, the more likely it is that you're closer to a final iteration. And if your production cost is high, then you don't want to go to market, or you don't want to go and produce something that just is totally insufficient in ways that you know in advance, because you might just waste that money on producing a product that's not your final product. But at the same time, I think businesses always had to have a final product before they launch. Probably wouldn't have very many businesses like that. That's just usually not how it goes. Usually you release a product, you learn a lot, and then you release another version and another version. I just recently read a book by Tony Fadell called Build, which is, I think, a kind of Bible for many tech entrepreneurs. And he has a framework for thinking about kind of the first, second, and launch of a product and on the first go around. And often there's a lot of learning about just how you bring a product like that to market. So for us, we had to learn how to manufacture food, from the actual process to certifications and safety. And that was it's not even binary. You have to kind of bring cost down over time. The first time you produce the product, if you're setting up your own manufacturing, it's going to be so expensive compared to what you can achieve at scale. So I think there's trade-offs on both sides. For certain products, it's totally fine to have an MVP that's kind of insufficient because you'll just learn a lot. And that's, I think in food, you don't really want to be known as a company that produced a subpar product. Food is a little different than kind of a tech product, because if you have a visceral negative reaction to it, you're never going to trust whoever provided you that food again. We're tuned to sensing danger in that format. So it's a balancing act, I think, long story short.
Yeah, the food space is interesting. I noticed that too. Yeah, that makes sense. It's just like everyone's been to a bad restaurant and that's it, right? You're never going back. So that's a good point. So talk to me, I guess, about, so you create, I think I read somewhere it took you 2 years to actually get it right before it was ready to go to market. Is that accurate? Is what I read?
Yeah, let me timeline it a little bit. So we really got going in summer 2018, and we had some MVPs then. And then really it was in January of 2019 that we were really shipping a bunch of product out to people in the keto. And that product was good. It was good. It wasn't amazing. And so we then took a few months to really develop that product and work on the manufacturing side of things to get the cost down. And then we launched in probably July or August of 2019. So I guess about a year and a half to get to a product that was kind of like the product that we ran with for the majority of the business. And then actually a few years later, we upgraded the manufacturing process again. And one of the things you learn if you do food is that you can't really take what you do in the home kitchen and scale it all the way up. There's certain things that on industrial equipment, you need to do. You need to get various things right about the viscosity of the batter or whatever you're working with, and dryness and things like that. And so we did a whole other round of R&D in order to be able to produce on more automatic equipment. And that was completed, I think, in 2021, potentially. So yeah, it's an ongoing thing. And I think probably there's still more formulation tweaks in store for us.
Okay. And so all this R&D, I know it's not free, right? So where we get this, have you raised money within this 2-year period to actually continue the R&D?
Yes, we did. I'll say briefly, it's not free if you produce with, or if you do R&D with a shop. There's various places that do food R&D. You could probably spend $50,000 on R&D with a really high caliber shop, or more, depending on how big the scope of work is for your project. A lot of what we did was in-house. The majority was. Businesses almost always lose money before they make money because there's just startup costs involved, and there's always effort to get that first product to your first customer. There's a lot that happens before you make that sale. One of the things you can do is, if you have a lot of skill in-house, or you have the persistence or the stick-to-itiveness to just iterate and learn yourself, you can save a lot of money that way. So with Quavos, I did the R&D for the first year or so. We did hire food scientists to help us with some ingredient selection and a little bit of modification of the recipe, about a year in probably. And that was helpful, but it was still just incremental. So it was it was kind of the same thing that we might be able to do, but just adding some extra knowledge. Yeah, I would encourage people to not go out and, look for talent if there's a possibility of doing it in-house. But if you find that, your skills are not sufficient or that it's not worth your time for some reason because your time is better spent on some other area of the business, then of course you go and find talent. And you don't want to be stuck in a position where you never hire or you never outsource because you can spend, your 100% of your energy divided across 100 tasks. You never really make it very far in any one area. So it's important to focus, but it's also important to be scrappy. If you're cash constrained. 2020, we did spend $50K to work on that commercialization process to get the product, into a form where we could produce it much more cheaply. So that was kind of an upfront investment in a long-term economic improvement for the business.
So I interviewed a young lady. She also had a product company, ended up closing it down. And one of the things that she shared with me, as far as when you have a product company, when she launched, she did a lot of demonstrations, a lot of demos, at your local Kroger, whatever, get awareness to the product. What was your launch, your launch campaign to actually get awareness? And I noticed also too, if you can speak to, because I know when you were on Shark Tank, you spoke about 20% being retail, 80% being online. So you can talk about those sales distribution channels, your launch campaign, then those sales distribution channels that you chose. Why did you choose those directions?
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, it was Amazon, DTC, so our own website, Quivos.com. And let me start with retail. So one thing, before we even had a finished product, we were talking with people in the food space to learn how businesses typically grow. One of the things that was emphasized was that in the long run, retail would be the likely biggest opportunity. If it just, for example, like the great products in Costco can do, tens of millions of dollars of sales in just a single region of the, 7 regions that they have in the States. And online, you often hit kind of points of diminishing returns where you have to spend so much trying to acquire more customers that it's really not worth scaling. But that said, online, nobody's going to say no. I mean, in terms of there's no buyer that says, no, we're not going to take this. You just sign up for an Amazon account or you build your own website and you can sell, the very day that you have product ready to ship. And so there's something much more stepwise or about retail. You have these points of yes or no that determine your distribution. Online, it's not like that. It's much more gradual, but you end up hitting diminishing returns. So there's trade-offs. With retail, the strategy that people discussed really was to focus. So find your optimal kind of channel wherever you could really find the customer that's going to be really suitable for your product, and focus out regionally as well. So the last thing you want to do, if you've got a high-end food product, is go to Walmart nationally. Not that they would take you, but if you do that, then you're just not going to have the marketing budget to support the launch of those stores. What will happen is they'll make an order, or even they'll ask you to do a free fill and basically put product on shelves for free in the first time you provide, and then the product won't move, and then you'll get charged for the product that's spoiled or whatever or expired with the retailer. They won't reorder, so you'll just end up losing hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars doing that. So instead, what you want to do is find a local chain that's really appropriate for your product. You market aggressively. So you sample, you take advantage of whatever offers the retailer's willing to give in terms of shelving and displays and whatnot. You make sure the product really looks awesome on shelves, including in the category. So you take your designs that you're considering and you go to that shelf and you look and see how the product stands out, or not in that category. And then you basically amass a really, really good story that you can then take to the next level of buyers. So, here in Illinois, we moved a lot of units per week in 28 Whole Food stores or whatever. And so now we're ready for the Midwest region. And so we take that awesome story, we show that to buyers of subsequent scales. I think what that can end up looking like is that you start small, maybe you do 100K in your first year in retail, but then you can 5X, the next year, you can 2X the next year, you can take it national. And so even though it's this kind of step-by-step process, maybe 10 years later, you have a business that's doing a tremendous amount of volume in national. Now it's competitive. And so it's not like everybody just gets to step up and be nationally distributed and doing millions of dollars in sales. And Quivos, so we've sold, which we might talk about later, but I don't believe we are at that point yet. The new ownership has not taken it to national scale yet. We're still kind of in that process of proving demand in the channels that we're in. That's retail. And then online, we were focused on Amazon. I'll say briefly, Amazon versus DTC. On Amazon, they're Amazon's customers, not your customers. You don't have their email, you don't know their name, you don't have much demographic information. And so it's difficult to really own that audience, or you just can't. But that said, Amazon is like a Walmart superstore. And your own Shopify store is like a little stand out in the desert. There's just nobody coming there. So you need to route all this traffic to your stand if you want to do it that way, as opposed to being present where the customers are actually already. So that was kind of the trade-off for us. We ended up focusing on Amazon rather than on the direct-to-consumer channel on our Shopify site.
There's a lot there I want to unpack, and because I read some other stuff from Forbes about life lessons, stuff that you learned from this, and I know you're in another company we might get to, but you mentioned going in retail. I'm very specific. So the individual because I love reaching out to individuals, the individual that you would go, say I'm going on LinkedIn to try to find an individual to touch base with, what is their title? Would it be buyer, that I'm looking for someone that's a buyer?
Exactly.
Okay, perfect. Let's talk about you sell the company, it's growing. So within because I said in 2018, I heard you on Shark Tank, you said you're going to do 1.3 in sales, 1.3 million in sales, right?
Yep, that's right. I think that was it must have been 2020 that we had done 1.3 million in sales.
Let's talk about growth, scaling, because you sold the business. Market, let's cover different strategies, like your marketing strategy, operations. Before you sold, like, can you speak to us around, like, once you did 1.3, what was your main marketing strategy?
So as you mentioned, we were like 80-20 online and retail, with most of that 80 being Amazon. And so on Amazon, there was, I think, let's say 3 buckets of things that we were doing. One was something that everybody can do easily, which is spend money on Amazon ads. Back then, people were getting much higher returns on that. So in general, the more competitive a market is, the more costly it's going to be to advertise and actually get shown to consumers. Online has been filling in. Now it's pretty damn saturated. Not to say there's not going to be, many, many more companies emerging and whatnot, but there's probably going to be a lot of turnover where people come in, they fail, other people come in, etc. But it's really competitive now to advertise online. And so back then, we might have been getting a 3x on our ad spend, meaning for every $15 of ad spend we would spend, we would see $45 in sales. And now probably that's going to be, if we were to launch Quivos today, it would be a less primary part of the strategy because we just wouldn't see that kind of return. The next thing was PR. So this is probably our best return on ad spend activity. It won't work for everybody, in part, again, because things are filling in. There's much more saturation. And so, a publication is just worth less in terms of what it can do for driving sales than it used to be. But you also have to be PR worthy to track the publications in the first place. And you have to be interesting to the end reader to have a chance of converting to sale. And so in our case, we were talking about a really novel thing, which was a chip made from egg whites instead of potatoes or grain or whatever. So that was especially, interesting to the keto crowd, which is probably around 10 to 15% of the population was actually exploring keto at that point. And so we would have some publications that we didn't pay anything for because we just had journalists that were interested in writing about them. And we would see 5, 10, 15K of sales over the couple of days after which that was published. So that was a great part of our strategy in 2019, 2020. And that definitely, that drove traffic to Amazon and to our website.
Were these national publications or just local publications?
They were usually national online publications. So places like Delish.com and Pop Sugar wrote about us. Men's Health or Women's Health maybe online wrote about us. So they had pretty good publications with good online reach. And that, drove real traffic for us. Then the third piece was influencer. What we found with influencers is kind of a power law where a very small fraction of influencers would drive the majority of our sales. And most influencers would drive absolutely no sales. So it was a numbers game. We sent out a lot of samples, basically said, hey, if you like it, please post. This was Instagram 2019. Basically same story as PR and ads and any ads in the sense that it used to work really well in terms of return on ad or return on spend, and now not as well. Part of that was that, if you're an influencer and your audience, you make a free post and your audience goes and buys 50 packs of whatever that product is, you've just created $1,000 of value for somebody else and you've captured none of it except for the free sample that you got. And so anybody that has an audience that's actually purchasing like that goes and monetizes it over time. So it gets more saturated, more crowded. The ability to get a high return on your spend diminishes. Again, probably wouldn't work as well today, but it worked really well back then.
You mentioned one of the lessons learned is laser focusing on certain channels to better understand their core audience will help the brand move more efficiently in the market versus burning cash to build ubiquitous presence. So, and I hear you now talking about all the different channels and all the different things you're doing now, the fact that you're the CEO of a new brand. Are you applying the same strategies or now are you laser focused in on certain channels?
Yeah, definitely laser focused. We had a much more run as fast as possible kind of mindset going into the Quivos years. And I think it also, the fact that we had, we never had any experience in business. So we had no idea that this could work, right? We had no idea. I think the hope was kind of, we would try everything and see if anything worked. And if we ever got a yes, we would of course, run with that and be, and celebrate and all that. So I think back then the mindset was like, let's do everything we can. That wasn't coming. I'm a fundamentally lazy person. I don't like to do a bunch of stuff. I like to just do the stuff that's interesting. But my co-founder was, he wanted to work really hard and really just make it happen in any way possible. And, no matter how difficult, no matter how much effort we had to put in to get an outcome, that was what he wanted to do, which definitely served us because we got to kind of just get out there in the market and get exposure, and ultimately led to a Shark Tank appearance and a sale. There's a lot of places where we spent a lot of money, trying to make something happen. It didn't work, or it didn't end up being a sustainable thing for the company. There's pros and cons to spreading your energy across many different things versus focusing. But because of my personal character of wanting to do less, and also because of cash constraints, I do think it could be potentially very helpful to focus on one channel and really optimize your presence on that channel. And then after you built that foundation, then you can go look for additional revenue opportunities elsewhere. So in the case of LifeStacks, which is a company I'm currently operating, we just focus on Amazon. We have a website, but we never send traffic to the website. We only focus on Amazon. The benefit of that is we've come to understand the channel. We see what's required. We've dialed it in to the point where we're profitable, and which is something that Quavos during our entire tenure running the company, we could never say. We were never profitable. We raised money, we burned money. And that was the trajectory of the company. One other thing to say is that the climate can change in terms of fundraising and what investors are looking for. In 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, when we were raising money for Quavos and trying to build it, money was much easier. There was just a ton of capital around. People were interested in food in part because there was a few high-profile exits in food. And so I think investors got the idea that you could really do some cool stuff, in food and scale things quickly and make a big splash. Also, it was becoming clear back then that the legacy companies like Kraft couldn't actually cultivate, fast-growing, profitable food ventures as like internal startups. They just didn't quite have the ear to the market or the flexibility or the creativity to pull those things off. And so there was a lot of interest in small companies that had, interesting founder stories and very cool differentiated products and all that. So I think a lot more money went into food in those days. And so that made it possible to kind of run a fundamentally unsound business for longer. Our product cost of goods was never low enough to have a healthy business, but we just raised, burn. And we got lucky that at the very end of that cycle, we finally found a way to make the product more cheaply, and we found a buyer that was interested. But now I don't have that luxury, and I'm glad that I don't have that luxury. I can't go and burn millions of dollars of other people's money. I have to be thoughtful and conservative and smart, tactical, and aspirationally, at least, all those things. In practice, maybe less so. But yes, we're focused is the long story short.
Speaking of that, raising money, investors. I heard Mark Cuban once say it's not, a lot of entrepreneurs celebrate raising money, but they shouldn't. It's an obligation. It's something that you have to keep moving. So what are investors, in your experience in raising money and someone that's given a pitch, is there a few things you can talk about? What are investors looking for when they're about to give their money?
Yeah, I'm sure there's people that have thought about this a lot better than I have and have much more succinct things to say about it. But what I would say is maybe there's two pieces of the puzzle. You have to at least have a case that your business can be a sound business. There has to exist a market that's large enough. You have to really get product costs down to a reasonable level, and usually that entails like differentiation, because if you come to the market with the same thing that a big company's already selling, they're just going to crush you. There's not going to be a way for you to really grow. You have to do something differently. Differentiation itself is not enough. It has to be differentiated in a way that reflects the way in which the market is able to expand on the basis of consumer preferences. Here's a question. What drives changes in the mix of products in the market over time? So why are we buying different things than we bought 30 years ago? What accounts for those differences? It was a rhetorical question, but I'd love to hear what you think of that.
No, I'm thinking, I want to think about that. What drives change in the market? That's a great question. I know one of the things that I used to buy a product and cost of goods get higher. I know stuff is not made. I know stuff I used to buy when I was a kid and I buy them now. They're literally the same product, but they're totally different. I can tell the difference. So I would say cost of good, inflation, economy, it's a lot of different variables in there.
Okay, yeah, that's all interesting. I think there's what you're describing in part is how products kind of the value of products kind of gets diluted as the space has already saturated. Is now the incumbents are kind of rent seeking. They're extracting as much value from the presence as possible. So their quality is declining over time. I think there's definitely a trend in that direction in the case of mature categories. And I think that's a great point you're making. I was going to make a point that I think is complementary, which is that in terms of new products, so new entrants to the market, how does that work? How does it work that we get that we're consuming different things that were just not, that didn't exist 30 years ago. The question of whether the economy is going to be able to add innovation and new kinds of products really falls on the latent demand or the hidden demand of the consumer. So there's things that we want that we may or may not be able to express, that we may or may not be able to imagine a product that would satisfy them. But if there's an entrepreneur on the other side that is able to discover a way to satisfy those demands, but in a cost-effective way, then the market's going to bloom. It's going to grow into that area. So it's almost like, I almost think of it like you've got the sun and you've got like plants that are growing on the ground, and the diversity of strategies in the kind of like in biology will lead a bunch of different plants to go and find their own way of being able to absorb that light. In this case, the light that's emanating into the economy is consumer dollars. It's the fact that consumers are willing to go spend their buying power on various things, and companies are going to grow to meet that demand and fill in every single crack and crevice that they possibly can. So I think, in a certain way, the market becomes more varied, the kind of varied demand of consumers. I forgot what the original question was, but yeah.
It was more around in investor tips. That's the good though.
Oh yeah. Oh, actually, yeah. Let me say. So I think differentiation itself is not enough. Here I am, a plant, and I've decided to grow off in a different direction where I'm not absorbing sunlight. It's not going to work, even though it's different. And so you need to find an actual opportunity. And so I think it's kind of, you have to be differentiated, but in a way that actually meets the market where it's at. So that the investors can be able to assess that on the basis of existing traction. They'll say, oh wow, yeah, you tapped into an audience and they're saying things about your product that indicate that they really do want it and they want it repeatedly. Or the investor may have their own thesis about the way in which consumer demand is going to change or is going to be revealed over time. I think that if there were a drug that enabled 90-year-olds to have the physical fitness of 25-year-olds, they would take it. It's very obvious, right? But I don't know that there's any pitch decks with that proposition because there isn't a product that can satisfy that demand right now. But if I'm an investor and somebody comes to me and says, I've got a drug that can do that, I'll say, yeah, that fits with my sense of what the latent demand in the economy is. And so that's interesting. That's differentiated in an interesting way. So I think that's kind of, that's maybe the most important thing I think about starting a company is that you're addressing latent demand.
Okay. So let's transition to selling the company, right? So and that was the first time you mentioned that Quavos was never profitable. That's the first time I heard. I didn't know that. Let's talk about preparation for sale. Like oftentimes when you hear people create business, sell a business, we think it's I used to think into some elaborate process, but walk us through how does that work? How do you prepare for the sale, for preparation, in as much detail as possible around, the buyer, what is he looking for? I'm sure he's looking at sales. What other things and aspects that could he be looking for that the average person might not be thinking about that can affect that sale?
Sure. For more mature companies, which are typically you don't have exits for very immature companies or companies that are losing a lot of money. It's not usual that would happen unless it's kind of an acqui-hire or an IP acquisition kind of situation. The case where an AI company that never did $1 of revenue gets folded up into Google or something because they've got a good team, they've got a good idea. And Google wants to absorb that. So it's possible in certain sectors that you can have, acquisition on the basis of things that are not just profitability or revenue. Less usual. And if, building a company today, I would not expect an outcome where I burn a lot of money and then somebody views that as valuable. I think one thing that made it possible for Quavos to exit, despite our track record of not being profitable, was that right at the time that we were exiting, we had discovered a way to make the product much more cheaply. Even though we hadn't been profitable historically, those new economics would enable us to be profitable. That showed the buyer that there was real value potentially in acquiring the business. For more mature companies, you typically sell on some multiple of revenue or profits. I've heard this. Somebody that does that facilitates acquisitions, like a broker. Usually, what they're selling is cash flow. Let's say I've got $10 million at my disposal to go buy a company. If some company is doing $100,000 of profit annually, in order for that to make sense, I have to expect to be able to take in $100,000 of profit for, 100 years? That's not a very good return on investment. I can put my money in the market and double my money quickly as opposed to, recouping my investment over the course of 100 years. So it's not very good. So, multiples are typically lower, 1, 2, 5, 10x your annual profits. Something that would, push that multiple higher would be the existence of a well-established brand. If you've got brand equity that you think could be turned into additional profit by the launch of additional products or the expansion into additional channels, then there's maybe some reason for a buyer to pay a higher multiple because they're not forecasting based on previous results, but on future expected returns. Yeah, I think the more interesting and the more opportunities there is for a company to grow, the better you can do in terms of an exit, given a previous amount of revenue and profitability. In our case, what happened was we thought we would need a new CEO to come in and kind of help the business take its next step, as we were going from a small to a medium-sized company. And so we were networking around, and one of the people that we met through that networking process had actually just left his own company that was a meat snacks company, and he was looking for his own brand to run. And so, he just happened to be in the market for something that was a lot like what we're doing, a small brand that he thought had a lot of potential and could scale. He loved the product and had been a user of the product for years before we even met him. So that helped. And yeah, so it was just a really good match. He saw the value in what we were doing. He thought he could grow it, and we were looking for a new home for it at that time.
You mentioned something, and I don't know if you mentioned this or your co-founder mentioned this, and they talked about good businesses are really simple, rooted in the customer need and meeting that. So my question is, someone that's a beginning entrepreneur that wants to be an entrepreneur, how do you go out and find the need? So do you have any frameworks for finding ideas, any sites? I know a lot of people sometimes use Reddit, use Google Trends. How do you find a need that has yet to be met, that hasn't been met yet in the market?
Maybe it was a Sam Altman, Lex Friedman podcast where I heard this. Maybe it was somebody else. I'm not sure. But whoever said it said, often the best entrepreneurs in the space will have been hobbyists in that space for years before they made a business. You can't just walk into a space and all of a sudden become an expert on how it's going to progress or what the needs are. It really helps to have intimate experience before you start a business. So I think you're going to want something that you can do as a project before you do it as a business. That way you can get really far and kind of do some of that iterative process before you even spend $1. So, in the case of LifeStacks, which is my new company, which is a supplement company, I was a real supplement enthusiast. I've been researching nutrition for years and consuming my own supplements for years before we started the company. And so I had a sense of what made for a great product, what people were looking for, the way in which the market was evolving beforehand. And so I think we've been ahead of the curve in terms of, offering products that really do meet the kind of like the revealed demand of consumers. Like we're really focused on balanced energy. And, as of 2018, when I was starting to get interested in creating a business, based on my supplement passion, we found energy products that were very imbalanced. So maybe the year Bang came out with 300 milligrams of caffeine, starting maybe a couple of years after we had this insight, there's been a shift to things that are much more smooth and sustainable. The kind of energy that helps you focus, but without making you feel anxious, that kind of thing. So that was just something that we as consumers understood. We didn't want to feel anxious. So we didn't see products that were addressing that need. I think that's a crucial piece of it. Become familiar before you go and make a business. In terms of how to find other businesses, I think probably having some thesis about the way in which the market's going to evolve. The AI stuff in kind of 2023, I thought there was a lot of people that saw what had already happened and acted as if we had reached some sort of equilibrium, and now we just need to fill in the space with all these AI gadgets and tools. But if you have more awareness in that about kind of the trajectory of the expansion of computation over time, and the possibilities for algorithmic improvements and improvements in the scale of compute that is being applied to these models, that with whatever you're building today is going to be obsolete in 6 months. I would not have recommended that anybody go and view Chat GPT 3.5 as like the basis for like a scalable, sturdy company in the long run. Maybe you can make a quick buck if you're like really good at spinning up things. But if I were going to do business in that sector, I would try to be thinking about the long run changes that might be expected rather than like sort of what's immediately possible. And you kind of like develop your passion, enthusiasm, and your vision. And hopefully you can kind of line up that vision with the actual timing of the capabilities that are being developed. And then, in other spaces, like, I'm not too familiar with most industries, so I don't know, but I'm sure there's a lot of people that are way better at thinking about what kind of businesses would pop up in various industries. But I know that in food, what do you want out of your food products? You want them to be nourishing. You want to feel good after you have them. You want to be satiated by them. You want them to be delicious. You want to be able to control your appetite around those things, that you're not overdoing it. So if you show me a food that doesn't meet any of those marks, I'll say, oh, that belongs to the past, not the future. Show me food that does meet those marks. I say, that's a really promising idea. And now we need to expose it to customers and see if they take to it. If not, we need to learn what's going wrong. So I think, I think it's really about understanding, rather than just like drop a pin in the middle of the market and say, this looks great, I'm going to do it. You want to understand the kind of roots and grow from there, basically.